Picture this. You're watching a Hollywood pirate movie, and there's Captain Jack Sparrow feasting on roasted turkey, fresh bread, and fine wine, while his crew celebrates around tables laden with exotic fruits and delicacies. The camera pans across golden goblets filled with the finest rum, platters of succulent meats, and crew members laughing heartily as they enjoy what appears to be an endless banquet aboard their magnificent vessel. Steam rises from perfectly cooked roasts, colorful tropical fruits overflow from wooden bowls, and the crew toasts their latest victory with crystal-clear rum that sparkles in the Caribbean sunlight. Now, let me shatter that romantic illusion with a dose of harsh reality that would make even the strongest stomach turn. Cut to an actual pirate ship in the 18th century. A weathered sailor sits hunched over in the dim light below deck, desperately trying to crack open a piece of hardtack, so hard it could double as cannonball ammunition. His calloused hands grip a rusty knife as he attempts to chip away at what was once flour and water, but now resembles a piece of fossilized wood. Nearby, his shipmate picks weevils out of what was once recognizable as salt pork, each white larva carefully extracted with the tip of a dirty fingernail. The stench of rotting provisions fills the cramped quarters, a mixture of rancid meat, moldy grain, and human desperation that would make a modern person vomit instantly. The only liquid available is a murky mixture of stagnant water and watered-down rum that tastes more like medicine than refreshment. The water barrel hasn't been cleaned in months, and green algae floats on the surface like a nauseating soup. Even the rum, once the pride of Caribbean distilleries, has been diluted to the point where it barely masks the foul taste of contaminated water. The wooden cup used for drinking is stained black with residue from countless previous uses, and no amount of scrubbing with salt water can make it truly clean. Welcome to the real world of pirate cuisine, where survival trumped flavor every single day, and every meal was a battle against decay, disease, and desperation. Today, we're rediving deep into the harsh reality of what pirates actually ate during their long voyages across treacherous seas. This isn't a story of abundance and luxury. It's a tale of maritime survival, where a single vitamin deficiency could mean the difference between life and a gruesome, prolonged death that could take weeks or even months to claim its victim. The truth about pirate food is far more fascinating and terrifying than any Hollywood portrayal could capture, because the reality was so brutal that modern audiences would likely find it unwatchable. We're talking about an era where preserving food meant the difference between successful piracy and becoming fish food yourself, where a moldy piece of bread was considered a delicacy, and where the sight of fresh fruit could bring grown men to tears of joy. These weren't just criminals of the sea living lives of romantic adventure. They were inadvertent pioneers of food preservation, forced by circumstances to become experts in keeping provisions edible for months at a time without refrigeration, without proper storage facilities, and certainly without the luxury of fresh ingredients. Every technique they developed, every method they used to extend the life of their food stores, was born from the knowledge that failure meant death, not just for themselves, but for every soul aboard their vessel. The pirates we're discussing lived during what historians call the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly from 1650 to 1730. When maritime trade was booming and the seas were filled with merchant vessels, carrying valuable cargo between the old world and the new. But these merchant ships also carried something else that pirates desperately needed: food supplies that were often only marginally better than what the pirates themselves had access to. Understanding the food situation aboard pirate ships requires us to first understand the broader context of maritime nutrition during this period. The challenges of feeding a crew at sea were monumental under the best circumstances, and pirates rarely operated under the best circumstances. They couldn't rely on regular supply lines, couldn't put into friendly ports for resupply, and couldn't plan their voyages around the availability of fresh provisions. Imagine trying to keep dozens, sometimes over 100 people fed for months at a time with no access to fresh food, no refrigeration, no understanding of vitamins or nutrition science, and limited storage space on vessels, designed primarily for warfare and cargo capacity rather than human comfort. Every cubic inch of a pirate ship was precious real estate, where space for food storage competed with room needed for cannons, ammunition, treasure, fresh water, and the crew themselves. A typical pirate ship might measure only 80 to 100 feet in length. Yet it needed to house anywhere from 50 to 150 people for voyages that could last 6 months or more. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Each person needed roughly 2 pounds of food per day to maintain basic health, meaning a crew of 100 would require about 200 pounds of food daily, or roughly 36,000 pounds of provisions for a 6-month voyage. When you consider that much of this food was preserved in heavy wooden barrels filled with salt or stored in containers that weighed nearly as much as their contents, the logistical challenges become staggering. The ocean itself was both their highway and their greatest enemy in the battle to keep food edible. Salt air didn't just corrode metal and wood, it penetrated everything, including food containers, accelerating spoilage and contamination. The constant motion of the ship meant that stored goods were in perpetual motion, grinding against their containers, breaking apart, and creating dust that attracted insects and vermin. Humidity was another relentless enemy. In tropical waters, the humidity below deck could reach nearly 100%, creating perfect conditions for mold, bacteria, and fungal growth that could turn a barrel of grain into a festering mass of decay within weeks. Temperature fluctuations wreaked havoc on stored goods as ships moved from cold northern waters to tropical heat, causing expansion and contraction that could burst containers and accelerate spoilage. Rats and other vermin saw the ship's provisions as an all-you-can-eat buffet that never closed. These weren't just occasional pests. They were permanent residents who bred prolifically in the warm, dark spaces below deck. A single pair of rats could produce dozens of offspring in a matter of months, and each rat consumed roughly an ounce of food per day while contaminating far more with their droppings and urine. Unlike merchant vessels that followed established trade routes with predictable resupply points, pirate ships often had to remain at sea for extended periods, avoiding ports where they might be recognized and captured. They couldn't simply stop at the next town when their food ran low. They had to carry everything they needed or find other ways to obtain it, usually through methods that weren't exactly legal. So what did they actually eat? The foundation of every pirate's diet rested on 3 main pillars that would challenge even the most adventurous modern eater: salt-preserved meat that could survive, nuclear war hardtack biscuits that could double as building materials, and whatever else could survive the journey without spoiling beyond recognition. Let's start with salt meat, the cornerstone of naval provisions throughout the Age of Sail and the stuff of nightmares for anyone who values their dental health. This wasn't your grandmother's ham or bacon. This was survival food engineered to last forever, regardless of what it did to the people who had to eat it. The preservation process began on land, where professional butchers would slaughter cattle and pigs specifically for naval provisioning. Speed was essential because decomposition began immediately after death, and without refrigeration, every minute counted. The animals were butchered into manageable chunks, typically weighing between 5 and 10 pounds each, sized to fit through the openings of the storage barrels. The salting process was both art and science, requiring precise knowledge of salt ratios, timing, and technique. Too little salt and the meat would rot before the voyage was over. Too much salt and it would become so preserved that it was essentially inedible, even by pirate standards. The meat was packed in layers within specially constructed oak barrels, with each layer separated by thick applications of coarse salt that had been specifically processed for meat preservation. This wasn't table salt. This was industrial-grade preservation salt, often grey or brown in color, containing impurities that actually aided in the preservation process. The salt drew moisture out of the meat through osmosis, creating an environment where the bacteria responsible for decay could not survive. However, this process fundamentally changed the meat's cellular structure, texture, and flavor profile. After weeks in salt, the meat underwent a transformation that would be unrecognizable to modern consumers. It became incredibly dense, taking on a texture somewhere between leather and wood. The salt didn't just season the meat, it essentially mummified it, creating a product that was technically edible but bore little resemblance to the animal it came from. The barrels containing this preserved meat were themselves marvels of maritime engineering and essential survival equipment. Constructed from carefully selected oak staves and bound with iron hoops, these containers had to withstand months of being tossed around in ship holds, exposed to varying temperatures, humidity levels, and the constant stress of ocean travel. Each barrel was sealed with tar to prevent leakage and marked with information about its contents and packing date. When a barrel was opened after months at sea, the experience was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Veteran sailors described the smell as a combination of leather, death, concentrated salt, and something uniquely oceanic that defied description. The meat itself had often changed color, becoming darker and more uniform, while the surface developed a whitish coating of crystallized salt that had to be scraped away before consumption. But the challenges didn't end with opening the barrel. The salt meat had become so hard that it required extensive preparation. Before it could be consumed, the standard technique involved soaking chunks of meat in water for several hours, sometimes overnight, to draw out some of the salt and soften the texture to something approaching chewable. Even after soaking, the meat remained incredibly tough and salty. Pirates developed various techniques for dealing with this iron-hard protein source. Some would pound it with mallets or the butts of their pistols to break down the fibers. Others would soak it in rum, believing that alcohol would help tenderize it while adding flavor. The most common preparation involved boiling the meat for hours in large pots, creating stews that were more about survival than cuisine. The cooking process itself presented challenges. Fresh water was precious and couldn't be wasted on excessive cooking. So the meat was often boiled in seawater, adding even more salt to an already oversalted product. The resulting broth was so salty it could be used to preserve other foods, and many pirates developed techniques for using this cooking liquid as a base for other dishes. A typical serving of salt meat might be just 2 to 4 ounces per person per day, carefully rationed to ensure the supply lasted the entire voyage. Pirates couldn't afford to run out of food in the middle of the ocean, so strict portion control was literally a matter of life and death. The meat was rarely eaten alone. It was typically combined with other ingredients to create something resembling a complete meal. And to help dilute the overwhelming saltiness, the nutritional impact of relying heavily on salt meat was significant and largely negative. While it provided protein and some essential amino acids, it was virtually devoid of vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which was essential for preventing scurvy. The high salt content also created additional health challenges, requiring more fresh water for digestion and potentially contributing to high blood pressure and kidney problems. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact of eating salt meat day after day, month after month, cannot be underestimated. The monotony of consuming the same tough, overly salty protein source meal after meal took a toll on crew morale that went beyond simple boredom. Many sailors reported that the sight and smell of salt meat could trigger nausea even when they were genuinely hungry. Now, let's talk about hardtack, the bread of the sea that was anything but bread as we know it, and which earned its reputation as both lifesaver and toothbreaker throughout maritime history. Hardtack was the ultimate survival food, designed not for pleasure but for persistence. A simple mixture of flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until it achieved a density that modern materials scientists would find impressive. The manufacturing process for hardtack was deliberately simple, because complexity would have made it impractical for large-scale production. Quality flour was mixed with just enough water to form a stiff dough, with salt occasionally added for flavor and additional preservation properties. The dough was then rolled flat, typically to a thickness of about ½ an inch, and cut into rectangles roughly the size of a modern smartphone. The baking process was crucial to hardtack's legendary durability. The biscuits were baked at relatively low temperatures for extended periods, sometimes up to an hour, until all moisture had been driven out and the result was hard enough to use as a weapon. Properly made, hardtack had a moisture content of less than 3%, creating an environment where bacteria and mold could not survive. A properly baked piece of hardtack was about as thick as your thumb and roughly 4 inches square, weighing approximately 2 ounces. When fresh, if you could call it that, it was merely very hard, requiring strong teeth and powerful jaw muscles to consume. After months at sea, exposed to varying humidity and temperature, it became what sailors accurately described as hard as a rock and twice as tasteless. The texture of aged hardtack defied easy description. It wasn't just hard, it was aggressively hard, possessing a density that seemed to increase with age. Sailors would joke that hardtack could be used as armor plating, currency, or building materials, and they weren't entirely wrong. There are documented cases of hardtack biscuits stopping musket balls, though whether this was due to the biscuit's hardness or the musket's poor quality remains a matter of historical debate. The process of eating hardtack was an ordeal that required planning, tools, and considerable determination. Step 1 involved breaking the biscuit into manageable pieces, which often required implements beyond human teeth. Sailors would use their knives, rocks, hammers, or even the butts of their pistols to crack the biscuits into smaller fragments. The sound of hardtack being broken echoed through the ship like gunshots, and experienced sailors could identify the vintage of hardtack by the sound it made when struck. Once broken into pieces small enough to fit in the mouth, the hardtack fragments had to be softened before they could be safely consumed. The standard technique involved soaking the pieces in whatever liquid was available: water, rum, coffee, or soup, for anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. Even after extensive soaking, hardtack retained a texture that modern people would find challenging, somewhere between cardboard and tree bark. But hardtack's problems extended far beyond its concrete-like consistency. The biscuits were magnets for every form of pest that could survive at sea, and the list of uninvited protein sources was extensive and disturbing. Weevils, small beetles, about the size of rice grains, found hardtack irresistible breeding grounds and would lay their eggs inside the flour before baking. The heat of the baking process didn't always kill these eggs, so weeks or months later, sailors would discover their biscuits contained small holes and were crawling with white larvae. Rather than waste precious food, most sailors developed a philosophical acceptance of this additional protein, giving rise to the saying, "The more weevils, the less hardtack to chew." Experienced sailors developed techniques for dealing with these unwanted additions. Tapping the biscuit firmly against a hard surface would cause many insects to fall out, or soaking the hardtack in liquid would cause the creatures to float to the surface, where they could be skimmed off with a spoon or piece of cloth. Maggots presented a different challenge. These were unnecessarily a sign that the biscuit had gone bad. They were often present from the beginning, having been introduced during the flour milling or storage process. These pale, segmented creatures would emerge from the hardtack when it was broken or soaked, creating a protein supplement that no one had ordered but everyone had to accept. The psychological impact of eating insect-infested food cannot be understated, particularly for sailors who were new to life at sea. The first encounter with weevily hardtack was often a traumatic experience that marked a sailor's transition from landlubber to true mariner. Veterans of the sea developed an almost philosophical acceptance of their protein-enhanced rations, and some even claimed that the insects improved the flavor, though this may have been bravado rather than genuine appreciation. Moisture was hardtack's greatest enemy after insects. Any dampness would cause the biscuits to become moldy within days, developing fuzzy growths in colors ranging from green to black to orange. Pirates became expert at detecting the early signs of mold and would scrape off the fuzzy growth to access the potentially edible interior. Beneath, the phrase "green" around the edges took on a very literal meaning when describing both food and the faces of sailors who had eaten questionable provisions. The preparation of hardtack-based meals became an art form among experienced ship's cooks, who were often among the most valued members of the crew. These maritime chefs developed creative techniques for transforming inedible hardtack into something approaching palatability. One popular preparation was skilligali, a dish made by soaking hardtack in water until it formed a paste, then frying it in whatever fat was available, usually rendered from salt pork or captured from raided vessels. Another favorite was burgoo, a porridge-like mixture of soaked hardtack, salt meat, and any available vegetables or grains. The cook would boil these ingredients together for hours, creating a thick, nutritious stew that provided both sustenance and the psychological comfort of eating something that resembled a complete meal. The success of burgoo depended heavily on the cook's skill and the availability of additional ingredients to mask the hardtack's inherent lack of flavor. Some cooks developed signature techniques for improving hardtack's palatability. Ground hardtack could be used as a thickening agent for soups and stews, providing body and nutrition without the challenge of chewing whole pieces. Hardtack crumbs could be mixed with fat and spices to create a primitive form of stuffing, or used as a coating for whatever meat or fish was available. The cultural significance of hardtack extended beyond mere nutrition. It became a symbol of maritime life, representing both the hardships and the resilience of those who chose to make their living on the sea. Songs, stories, and jokes about hardtack became part of maritime folklore, with sailors competing to tell the most outrageous tales about the age, hardness, or inhabitant population of their biscuits. Speaking of grains and other stored provisions, let's explore the supporting cast of the pirate pantry, the ingredients that provided variety, nutrition, and occasionally even flavor to their monotonous diet. Dried peas and beans were maritime staples that had been feeding sailors for centuries before pirates adopted them. And these legumes represented both opportunity and challenge in the pirate diet. Dried peas were particularly favored because they cooked relatively quickly compared to other preserved foods and provided a substantial feeling of fullness that helped combat the constant hunger that plagued most sailors. These weren't the bright green garden peas we know today. They were typically yellow or grey. Varieties that had been specifically selected for their ability to dry completely and store well in maritime conditions. The peas arrived on ship already dried to a moisture content low enough to prevent spoilage, but they still faced challenges during storage. Like all organic materials aboard ship, they were susceptible to insect infestation, mold growth, and contamination from vermin. Stored in cloth bags or wooden containers, the peas would often become homes to weevils, beetles, and other creatures that found them as appealing as humans did. Preparation of dried peas typically involved extensive soaking, followed by long cooking times to achieve anything approaching tenderness. The standard preparation was peas porridge, a thick soup made by boiling peas with water, salt, meat, and whatever other ingredients were available. The cooking process could take hours, requiring precious fuel and fresh water. But the result provided both nutrition and variety that was essential for crew morale. The nutritional value of peas was significant, providing protein, carbohydrates, and some vitamins that were otherwise missing from the pirate diet. However, like everything else in their food supply, the peas were often old, discolored, and harboring unwanted inhabitants by the time they were consumed. Pirates became expert at sorting through dried peas to remove obviously spoiled specimens, stones, dirt, and other foreign objects that had been included during processing. Dried beans presented similar opportunities and challenges, but required even more extensive preparation due to their harder texture and longer cooking times. Navy beans, black beans, and kidney beans were common varieties that found their way into pirate stores, usually acquired through raids on merchant vessels or purchases in port when funds and circumstances allowed. Bean preparation was a multi-day process that required advanced planning by the ship's cook. The beans had to be sorted to remove spoiled specimens and foreign objects, then soaked for 12 to 24 hours to begin softening. After soaking, they required hours of boiling to reach edibility, consuming precious fuel and water while filling the ship with steam and cooking odors that could be detected for miles. The resulting bean dishes were hearty and filling, providing protein and fiber that helped combat some of the nutritional deficiencies inherent in the pirate diet. However, beans also came with digestive consequences that could make life in the cramped quarters below deck even more challenging than usual. Pirates developed a crude understanding of this cause-and-effect relationship and would sometimes ration bean consumption to avoid overwhelming the ship's primitive sanitation facilities. Oats and barley also found their way into pirate stores, though in much smaller quantities than hardtack or salt meat. These grains could be cooked into porridge, added to stews for bulk and nutrition, or ground into coarse flour for making primitive breads or thickening soups. Like other stored grains, they were susceptible to insect infestation and mold, requiring careful sorting and preparation before use. The grinding of grains into flour was accomplished using primitive hand mills, or even improvised methods like pounding with mallets or cannonballs. The resulting flour was coarse and often contained bits of hull insects and other foreign matter, but it provided variety and the psychological comfort of eating something that resembled bread, even if it bore little similarity to the bakery products of land-based life. Rice, when available, was highly prized for its versatility and relatively long storage life. It could be boiled into porridge, used as a base for stews, or eaten as a side dish with salt meat or fish. However, rice was often expensive and difficult to obtain, making it more of an occasional treat than a dietary staple for most pirate crews. The spice selection aboard a pirate vessel was limited but absolutely crucial for making their monotonous and often unpalatable diet bearable. Salt was obviously abundant, both from the preservation process and from the sea itself. But it was hardly a flavor enhancer, given that everything they ate was already oversalted to the point of being nearly inedible. Black pepper, when available, was worth its weight in silver for its ability to mask unpleasant flavors and add some sensation to otherwise bland meals. A small amount of pepper could transform salt pork from merely survivable to something approaching palatable. Pirates would carefully ration pepper, using just enough to improve their food without exhausting their limited supply. Bay leaves, dried herbs, garlic, and occasionally onions were treasured additions that could transform a basic stew into something that resembled actual cuisine. These seasonings were typically acquired through raids on merchant vessels or purchases during port calls, and their availability varied dramatically depending on the crew's recent success and location. Vinegar served multiple purposes beyond flavoring. It helped preserve other foods, could be used for cleaning, and provided some vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy. Pirates would add vinegar to water to make it more palatable and safer to drink, and it became an essential ingredient in many of their preserved food preparations. Sugar, when available, was treated as both seasoning and medicine. It could make bitter or unpalatable foods more tolerable, provided quick energy for demanding physical labor, and could be used to preserve fruits and other foods when the opportunity arose. However, sugar was expensive and highly sought after, making it more of a luxury item than a regular part of the pirate diet. The acquisition and storage of spices presented its own challenges. Most spices had to be kept dry to prevent mold and clumping, requiring careful storage in sealed containers that could withstand the humid conditions aboard ship. Pirates became expert at evaluating the quality and freshness of spices, knowing that spoiled seasonings could ruin an entire meal and waste precious food resources. But perhaps no aspect of pirate provisioning was more critical, complex, or culturally significant than their relationship with alcohol, particularly rum, which served as medicine currency, social lubricant, and survival tool, all rolled into one amber-colored liquid that became synonymous with pirate culture itself. The popular image of rum-soaked pirates isn't entirely inaccurate, but the reality was far more about survival than celebration. Fresh water was the most precious and problematic provision on any sea voyage, and without proper purification methods or understanding of bacterial contamination, water stored in wooden barrels would become unsafe to drink within weeks of being stored. The process of water contamination aboard ship was both predictable and dangerous. Fresh water was typically stored in large oak barrels that had been used for various purposes before being pressed into service for water storage. These barrels, despite being treated with tar and other preservatives, were never truly sterile and often contained residues from their previous contents. Within days of storage, fresh water would begin developing a green slime coating on its surface as algae and bacteria began to flourish in the warm, humid conditions below deck. The water would take on an unpleasant odor, reminiscent of stagnant ponds, and a taste that could induce vomiting in people not accustomed to maritime conditions. By the time a barrel had been open for a week, the water would be thick with organic growth and potentially dangerous to consume. Alcohol, particularly rum and beer, served as both beverage and water purification system. The alcohol content killed many of the bacteria and parasites that made water unsafe to drink, extending its storage life significantly and making it safer for human consumption. However, pure rum was too strong, too valuable, and too intoxicating to be consumed in the quantities necessary for daily hydration. The solution was grog, a mixture of rum and water that provided hydration, while remaining relatively safe to drink, and preventing the crew from being constantly intoxicated. The standard grog recipe called for 1 part rum to 3 or 4 parts water, creating a beverage with an alcohol content of roughly 10 to 15%, strong enough to kill bacteria but weak enough to allow functional consumption throughout the day. The daily rum ration was sacred among sailors and pirates alike, representing not just refreshment but survival itself. This wasn't about getting drunk, though that certainly happened, but about staying alive and maintaining basic health. A typical ration might be a 1/4 pint of rum mixed with 3/4 pint of water, consumed twice daily with meals. The ceremony surrounding the distribution of grog became an important part of shipboard routine and culture. The rum was typically stored in a central location under the control of the ship's quartermaster or captain, ensuring fair distribution and preventing unauthorized consumption. The measuring and mixing of grog was done publicly, with crew members watching to ensure they received their proper ration. The quality of rum available to pirates varied dramatically, depending on their recent success, location, and connections. High-quality rum, obtained through raids on Spanish or British merchant vessels, was smooth, flavorful, and represented the finest products of Caribbean distilleries. This premium rum was often reserved for special occasions, celebrations, or trading purposes. Mid-quality rum, which made up the bulk of most pirates' supplies, was serviceable but unremarkable, strong enough to serve its purpose but lacking the refinement of premium products. This rum was typically used for daily grog rations and general consumption, providing the alcohol content necessary for water purification without wasting valuable high-quality spirits. Low-quality rum, often the only option available in remote ports or from disreputable suppliers, could be harsh enough to strip paint and was sometimes mixed with water so foul that the combination was barely drinkable, even with alcohol as purifying effects. Pirates would sometimes redistill low-quality rum to improve its potency and palatability, though this required equipment and expertise that wasn't always available. The process of rum production in the Caribbean created a product that was ideally suited for maritime use. Made from sugarcane molasses and distilled to high alcohol content, rum was naturally resistant to spoilage, and actually improved with age when properly stored. The high alcohol content made it an excellent preservative for other foods and medicines, and its relatively neutral flavor made it compatible with a wide range of food preparations. Beer represented another important alcoholic option, though it presented different challenges for long-term storage. Beer would sour relatively quickly in the ship's hold, developing an acidic taste and sometimes becoming downright dangerous to consume. The fermentation process would continue in storage, potentially causing barrels to burst and creating alcohol levels that were unpredictable and sometimes dangerously high. When fresh, beer was often preferred over rum by many pirates, because it was less intoxicating, more filling, and provided some nutritional value through its grain content. Beer also mixed better with food preparations and could be used as a cooking liquid for stews and porridges. However, the storage challenges meant that beer was typically consumed quickly after acquisition, making it more of an occasional treat than a dietary staple. The cultural significance of rum among pirates extended far beyond its practical uses as a beverage and water purifier. Rum became the currency of maritime society, used to settle debts, seal agreements, and facilitate trade. A bottle of high-quality rum could buy information, passage, or protection in ports where pirates needed to conduct business. Rum also served as medicine in an era when medical knowledge was limited and proper pharmaceuticals were unavailable. It was used as an anesthetic for crude surgeries, an antiseptic for cleaning wounds, and a pain reliever for everything from toothaches to broken bones. The phrase Dutch courage refers to the practice of consuming alcohol before dangerous activities, and pirates regularly used rum to steady their nerves before battles or hazardous operations. The social aspects of rum consumption created bonds among crew members and established hierarchies within pirate society. Sharing rum was a gesture of friendship and trust, while withholding it could be seen as an insult or punishment. The quality of rum a pirate could afford or access became a status symbol that reflected their success and position within the crew. But alcohol consumption also created problems that went beyond simple intoxication. Pirates who became dependent on alcohol faced withdrawal symptoms when supplies ran low, potentially compromising their ability to function during critical moments. The combination of poor nutrition, harsh living conditions, and regular alcohol consumption took a cumulative toll on health that contributed to the relatively short life expectancy of most pirates. The relationship between pirates and alcohol was further complicated by the fact that many ports and trading centers used alcohol as a form of currency or trade goods. Pirates had to balance their desire to consume their alcohol supplies against the need to use them for trading, bartering, or bribing officials. This created a constant tension between immediate gratification and long-term survival needs. Now we must confront the dark reality of what this limited, monotonous, and nutritionally deficient diet did to the human body. The health consequences of pirate nutrition were severe, predictable, and often fatal, turning every long voyage into a race between reaching their destination and succumbing to diseases that were entirely preventable with proper food. Scurvy stands as the most feared and deadly consequence of maritime nutrition, a disease that became synonymous with life at sea and claimed more pirate lives than battles, storms, and executions combined. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, also known as ascorbic acid, which the human body cannot produce on its own and must obtain from dietary sources, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables. Vitamin C is essential for the production of collagen, a protein that serves as the building blocks for connective tissues throughout the body. Collagen holds our skin together, maintains the integrity of blood vessels, supports our joints, and keeps our teeth anchored in our gums. Without adequate vitamin C, the human body literally begins to fall apart at the molecular level. The insidious nature of scurvy made it particularly terrifying for pirates and sailors. The early symptoms were subtle and could easily be attributed to the general hardships of life at sea. Victims would first notice increased fatigue and a general feeling of malaise that seemed like a natural response to hard physical labor and poor living conditions. Joint pain and muscle aches were common complaints that could be dismissed as occupational hazards. But, as the vitamin C deficiency continued and deepened, the symptoms became increasingly horrific and unmistakable. The gums would begin to swell and become tender, making eating painful even when food was available. The swelling would progress until the gums became spongy and dark red, bleeding at the slightest touch and eventually bleeding spontaneously. As the disease advanced, teeth would begin to loosen as the collagen holding them in place deteriorated. Pirates would wake up to find teeth in their bedding, having fallen out during sleep. The remaining teeth would become loose and painful, making it impossible to chew even the soft foods that were occasionally available. The skin effects of advanced scurvy were equally disturbing. Old wounds that had healed months or years earlier would begin to reopen as the scar tissue, dependent on collagen for its integrity, began to break down. New wounds would refuse to heal, remaining open and vulnerable to infection indefinitely. Even minor cuts or scratches would become persistent sores that could eventually become life-threatening infections. Bruising would appear spontaneously as blood vessels weakened and ruptured under normal pressure. These bruises, called petechial hemorrhages, would start small but could grow to cover large areas of the body. The skin would take on a sickly, yellowish pallor as the victim's overall health declined, and a characteristic foul breath would develop that could be detected from several feet away. The psychological effects of advanced scurvy were as devastating as the physical symptoms. Victims would experience severe depression, anxiety, and eventually hallucinations. As their brain function was affected by the nutritional deficiency and the stress of their declining physical condition, many scurvy sufferers would lose the will to live, becoming apathetic and withdrawn, even as their shipmates tried to help them. In the final stages of scurvy, victims would experience organ failure as their cardiovascular system, dependent on collagen for vessel integrity, began to collapse. Internal bleeding would occur as blood vessels throughout the body weakened and ruptured. Death was not quick or merciful. It was a slow deterioration that could take weeks or even months, during which the victim remained conscious and aware of their declining condition. Contemporary accounts from pirate ships describe scenes that sound like something from a horror movie. Crew members with gums so swollen they could unspeak. Sailors whose legs were covered in bleeding sores that wouldn't heal, and men who had lost so many teeth they could uneat even the softest foods available on board. The tragedy of scurvy was that it was entirely preventable with even small amounts of fresh fruit, vegetables, or certain preserved foods that retained their vitamin C content. Citrus fruits like limes, lemons, and oranges were particularly effective, requiring only small daily portions to prevent the disease entirely. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and even sprouted seeds could provide enough vitamin C to maintain health. Some experienced ship captains had learned through trial and error to combat scurvy by carrying citrus fruits, pickled cabbage, or other vitamin C sources when possible. However, many pirates either didn't understand the connection between diet and scurvy, or couldn't obtain the necessary foods due to their outlaw status and limited resources. The British Royal Navy's eventual adoption of lime juice rations for their sailors, earning them the nickname limeys, came from hard-won experience with scurvy's devastating effects. But pirates, operating outside legal channels and unable to rely on systematic provisioning, continued to suffer from scurvy at rates that would be considered epidemic by modern standards. The impact of scurvy on pirate operations was profound and far-reaching. Entire crews could be decimated by the disease, leaving ships drifting helplessly with too few healthy sailors to operate them effectively. The fear of scurvy influenced pirate tactics, strategy, and route planning. Crews would risk dangerous raids on coastal settlements simply to obtain fresh food, knowing that the alternative was a slow, agonizing death. Pirates developed crude understanding of scurvy prevention through observation and experience. They noticed that crews who had recently raided ships carrying fresh provisions were healthier than those subsisting entirely on preserved foods. Some pirates made the connection between eating certain foods and maintaining health, though they lacked the scientific understanding to explain why citrus fruits or fresh vegetables made such a difference. The psychological impact of watching shipmates die from scurvy created a culture of desperation around fresh food that influenced pirate behavior in ways that extended far beyond simple hunger. The sight of fresh fruit could literally bring grown men to tears of relief and joy, and the acquisition of fresh provisions was often celebrated more enthusiastically than the capture of gold or silver. But scurvy wasn't the only nutritional disease that plagued pirate crews. Night blindness, caused by vitamin A deficiency, was common among pirates who had been at sea for extended periods without access to fresh vegetables, dairy products, or liver. This condition made it dangerous to navigate or fight during nighttime hours, when many pirate operations took place for tactical advantage. The symptoms of night blindness developed gradually as the body's vitamin A stores were depleted. Pirates would first notice difficulty seeing in low light conditions, then complete inability to see in darkness. This was particularly problematic for sailors who needed to work the rigging or handle weapons during night attacks. Some pirates attributed this condition to spending too much time in the bright tropical sun, not understanding that it was actually caused by nutritional deficiency. Beriberi, caused by thiamine, vitamin B1 deficiency, was another common ailment among pirates subsisting on polished rice and refined flour products. This disease affected the nervous system and cardiovascular function, causing weakness, confusion, and eventually heart failure. Pirates suffering from beriberi would experience difficulty walking, tremors, and mental confusion that could make them liabilities during dangerous operations. Pellagra, resulting from niacin vitamin B3 deficiency, caused skin rashes, diarrhea, dementia, and eventually death. This disease was particularly common among pirates whose diet consisted heavily of corn-based products without proper preparation methods that would have made the niacin bioavailable. The mental symptoms of pellagra could cause erratic behavior that endangered the entire crew. Iron deficiency anemia was virtually universal among pirates due to their diet's lack of fresh meat, green vegetables, and the frequent blood loss from injuries and poor dental health. Anemic pirates were weak, tired, and unable to perform the demanding physical labor required aboard ship. They were more susceptible to infections and recovered slowly from injuries. Protein deficiency, while less common than vitamin deficiencies, could occur during extended periods when even salt meat supplies ran low. This condition caused muscle wasting, weakness, and increased susceptibility to infections. Pirates suffering from protein deficiency would lose weight rapidly and struggle to maintain the physical strength needed for their demanding lifestyle. The combination of multiple nutritional deficiencies created a synergistic effect, where each deficiency made the others worse. A pirate suffering from scurvy would be more susceptible to infections, which would be more severe due to protein deficiency and slower to heal due to vitamin A deficiency. This cascade of health problems could rapidly transform a functional crew member into a liability who required care and resources the crew could ill afford. Food poisoning was another constant threat that went beyond simple spoilage. Without understanding of bacterial contamination or proper food safety, pirates regularly consumed foods that were dangerously contaminated. Salmonella, botulism, and other foodborne illnesses could incapacitate entire crews within hours, leaving ships vulnerable to attack or unable to navigate safely. The symptoms of food poisoning aboard ship were particularly dangerous because of the limited medical knowledge and treatment options available. Severe diarrhea and vomiting could rapidly lead to dehydration. which was often fatal given the limited freshwater supplies. Pirates developed crude treatments for food poisoning, including consuming large quantities of rum to kill the poison and using various herbs and folk remedies of questionable effectiveness. Dental health represented a particular nightmare for pirates, though the causes were more complex than simple poor hygiene. The hardtack and salt meat that formed the basis of their diet were so tough that they could chip, crack, or break teeth through normal consumption. Many pirates developed techniques for eating these foods without damaging their teeth, but accidents were common and devastating. The high salt content in virtually everything pirates ate contributed directly to dental decay by altering the pH balance in their mouths and promoting bacterial growth. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant no natural cleaning action or beneficial nutrients for dental health. Most significantly, the vitamin C deficiency that caused scurvy also affected dental health directly, causing gums to become inflamed, infected, and unable to hold teeth properly. Pirates would often lose most or all of their teeth during their careers, not from fights or poor hygiene, but from the combined effects of their harsh diet and nutritional deficiencies. Toothless pirates faced additional challenges in consuming their already difficult food supply, often requiring shipmates to help prepare their food or subsisting on liquids and soft preparations. The psychological effects of chronic malnutrition and poor health cannot be underestimated in understanding pirate culture and behavior. Chronic hunger affects brain chemistry and function, leading to increased aggression, poor impulse control, and difficulty with complex decision-making. The combination of malnutrition, alcohol consumption, and the stress of their dangerous lifestyle created a population of men who were often unpredictable and prone to violence. Depression and anxiety were common among pirates, though these conditions were not recognized or treated as medical issues at the time. The stress of never knowing when the next decent meal would come, combined with watching shipmates suffer and die from preventable diseases, took a tremendous toll on mental health that affected crew cohesion and operational effectiveness. Sleep disorders were common due to hunger, discomfort, and the anxiety associated with their precarious nutritional situation. Pirates who could unsleep properly were less effective during the day and more prone to accidents and poor judgment. The cramped, uncomfortable sleeping conditions aboard ship were made worse by the constant gnawing of hunger and the discomfort of minor nutritional deficiency symptoms. The social dynamics aboard pirate ships were heavily influenced by food-related stress and competition. Arguments over food distribution were common and could escalate into violence that threatened crew unity. Pirates developed elaborate codes and agreements governing food sharing, with violations considered serious crimes that could result in punishment or death. Given these tremendous challenges with their basic provisions, pirates became extraordinarily resourceful in supplementing their diet through every available means. This resourcefulness wasn't just about improving their meals, it was literally about survival. And it influenced every aspect of their operations, from selecting targets to planning routes and timing their activities. Fishing represented one of the most obvious and accessible ways to supplement their diet. But the reality of fishing from a pirate ship was far more complex and challenging than modern people might imagine. Successful fishing required specialized equipment, considerable skill, favorable conditions, and most importantly, time, a commodity that pirates often couldn't afford when being pursued or planning attacks. The equipment needed for effective maritime fishing was substantial and competed with limited storage space needed for weapons, supplies, and plunder. Large nets required skilled operators and could only be used when the ship was stationary or moving slowly, making the vessel vulnerable to pursuit or attack. long fishing lines with multiple hooks could be deployed while underway, but required constant attention and often yielded disappointing results. Pirates developed various fishing techniques adapted to their unique circumstances and limitations. Trolling lines could be deployed behind a moving ship, allowing them to fish while traveling. Though this method was primarily effective for larger predatory fish that might or might not be present in their current waters, night fishing was sometimes more productive but required crew members to remain awake and alert when they should have been sleeping. When fishing was successful, the results provided more than just nutrition. They delivered a tremendous psychological boost to crew morale. Fresh fish represented a break from the monotonous cycle of salt meat and hardtack, providing flavors and textures that had been absent from their diet for weeks or months. The act of eating something truly fresh, something that had been alive hours rather than months earlier, had an impact on crew spirits that went far beyond simple nutrition. However, fresh fish also presented immediate challenges that required quick action and careful management. In tropical waters, fish began spoiling within hours of being caught, requiring immediate consumption or preservation. Pirates developed techniques for quickly preserving surplus fish through salting, smoking, or drying, though these methods required materials and time that weren't always available. Smoking fish required wood for fuel, which was often in short supply aboard ship and competed with other needs, like cooking fuel and emergency repairs. The smoking process also created visible smoke and distinctive odors that could be detected by other ships from considerable distances, potentially compromising the pirates' position and tactical advantage. Sea turtles represented particularly valuable catches that could provide substantial amounts of meat for larger crews. These ancient reptiles were relatively easy to catch when encountered, but required specialized knowledge for proper butchering and preparation. Turtle meat was considered a delicacy that provided excellent nutrition and could be preserved through various methods for extended consumption. The shells of sea turtles became valuable resources in themselves, serving as bowls, storage containers, and even improvised shields or tools. Turtle blood was sometimes consumed immediately for its nutritional value, and turtle eggs, when available, were considered among the finest foods available to pirates, rich in protein and nutrients that were otherwise nearly impossible to obtain. Birds represented another source of fresh meat that required different hunting techniques and offered varying levels of nutrition and palatability. Seabirds that landed on the ship's rigging could sometimes be caught with nets or even bare hands, though this required quick reflexes and often yielded only small amounts of meat. Different species of seabirds offered varying culinary experiences. Albatrosses were large enough to provide substantial meals, but were considered bad luck to kill by many sailors, creating cultural conflicts between superstition and nutrition. Smaller seabirds, like petrels or shearwaters, provided less meat, but were often more palatable and easier to catch. Some pirates became skilled at using firearms to hunt seabirds, though this required precious gunpowder and ammunition that were needed for combat. The sound of gunfire could also alert other ships to their presence, creating tactical disadvantages that had to be weighed against the nutritional benefits. Shore expeditions for food gathering became high-priority operations whenever pirates made landfall, whether on inhabited islands or deserted shores. These expeditions required careful planning, adequate manpower, and often involved significant risks from hostile inhabitants, dangerous wildlife, or unfamiliar terrain. Tropical islands offered the greatest variety of supplemental foods, with coconuts representing perhaps the most valuable single resource available to pirates. Coconut palms provided both the meat and milk that were rich in nutrients and could help combat various vitamin deficiencies. The water inside young coconuts was naturally sterile and could supplement precious freshwater supplies. While providing electrolytes and minerals, the process of harvesting coconuts required skill and often considerable risk, as the nuts grew high in palm trees that had to be climbed by crew members who were often weakened by malnutrition and unaccustomed to such activities. Falls from coconut palms could result in serious injuries that the crew was ill-equipped to treat. But the nutritional value of coconuts made the risk worthwhile. Wild fruits discovered during shore expeditions were treated like precious gems by vitamin-starved pirates. Mangoes, papayas, bananas, breadfruit, and other tropical fruits provided essential vitamins and were often consumed in massive quantities by crews who knew it might be months before they had another opportunity for fresh produce. The consumption of large quantities of fresh fruit after months of deprivation often led to digestive distress, as systems unaccustomed to fiber and natural sugars struggled to process the sudden abundance. Pirates would literally make themselves sick eating fruit, but they considered this a worthwhile price to pay for the nutritional and psychological benefits. Root vegetables like yams, cassava, and taro could provide carbohydrates and nutrients, while being relatively easy to harvest and prepare. These starchy foods could supplement or even replace hardtack in the short term, providing variety and better nutrition than their preserved grain supplies. Hunting land animals during shore expeditions could provide fresh meat that was far superior to salt pork in both flavor and nutritional value. Wild pigs were particularly prized targets, as they provided substantial amounts of meat that could feed large crews. Goats, when available, offered not only meat but potentially milk and cheese. If lactating females could be kept alive temporarily, the challenge of hunting on unfamiliar terrain while potentially facing hostile inhabitants made these expeditions dangerous undertakings that required military-style planning and execution. Pirates had to balance their desperate need for fresh food against the risks of ambush, injury, or becoming separated from their ship. Some islands harbored feral cattle that had been left by previous colonists or shipwrecked sailors. These animals represented massive protein sources, but required organized hunting efforts and significant processing capabilities to utilize effectively. The butchering of large animals also required immediate consumption or preservation, as the quantities involved exceeded what even large crews could consume before spoilage set in. Shellfish and other marine resources available in shallow coastal waters provided additional protein sources that were often easier to harvest than fish in deep water. Oysters, clams, mussels, and crabs could be gathered during low-tide expeditions, providing fresh protein and trace minerals that were otherwise unavailable in the pirate diet. However, shellfish also presented risks of poisoning, particularly in tropical waters where toxic algae blooms could contaminate entire populations of filter-feeding mollusks. Pirates had no way to test for such contamination and often learned about dangerous shellfish beds through tragic trial and error. But the most reliable and consistent way for pirates to improve their diet was through their primary profession: raiding and plundering merchant vessels. When pirates attacked ships, food supplies were often considered as valuable as gold, silver, or trade goods, and the condition of a captured vessel's provisions could determine whether a raid was considered successful or merely adequate. The food supplies found aboard merchant vessels varied dramatically depending on numerous factors: the ship's origin and destination, how long it had been at sea, the wealth and foresight of its owners, and the specific trade route it was following. A ship that had recently departed from a major port might carry fresh bread, cheese, live animals for slaughter, barrels of fresh water, and even luxury foods intended for wealthy passengers or crew officers. Conversely, a vessel that had been at sea for weeks or months might have provisions that were only marginally better than what the pirates themselves carried. However, even small improvements in food quality could make significant differences in crew morale and health, making even modestly provisioned ships worthwhile targets from a nutritional standpoint. Live animals represented particularly valuable prizes that required immediate attention and careful management. Chickens could provide fresh eggs daily for weeks before being slaughtered for meat, offering a sustainable source of high-quality protein and essential nutrients. The psychological impact of having fresh eggs available, even in small quantities, was tremendous for crews accustomed to preserved foods. Goats offered multiple benefits beyond their eventual meat value. Lactating females could provide fresh milk that could be consumed directly or processed into cheese, butter, or other dairy products that provided nutrients and variety unavailable in typical pirate rations. Goat milk was particularly valuable for treating scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Pigs represented walking food storage systems that could survive on scraps, while providing fresh pork when slaughtered. Pirates would often keep captured pigs alive as long as possible, feeding them kitchen scraps and any available organic waste to maintain freshness until the meat was needed. The ability to slaughter fresh meat as needed was a luxury that few pirates experienced regularly. Cattle, when captured, provided enormous quantities of fresh meat, but presented logistical challenges that tested the pirates' ability to process and preserve large amounts of protein quickly. A single cow could provide enough meat to feed a large crew for days, but without proper preservation techniques, much of the meat would spoil before it could be consumed. The process of butchering large animals aboard ship required skill, tools, and workspace that weren't always available. Pirates had to quickly learn butchering techniques or rely on crew members with previous experience in slaughtering and meat processing. The blood, offal, and waste products from butchering created sanitation challenges that had to be managed carefully to prevent attracting predators or creating health hazards. Merchant ships carrying cargo between European ports and American colonies often held treasures that went far beyond traditional pirate plunder. Coffee, sugar, chocolate, spices, and preserved foods represented luxury items that could transform pirate cuisine from mere survival to something approaching enjoyment. Sugar was particularly valuable for its multiple uses beyond simple sweetening. It could be used to preserve fruits and other foods, providing a way to extend the storage life of fresh provisions acquired through raids or shore expeditions. Sugar also provided quick energy for demanding physical labor and could improve the palatability of otherwise unappetizing preserved foods. Coffee and tea represented alternatives to the monotonous cycle of rum and contaminated water that formed the basis of pirate hydration. These beverages provided stimulation that could help combat the fatigue associated with malnutrition. While offering psychological comfort and variety, coffee was particularly valued for its ability to mask the taste of poor-quality water, while providing energy for demanding activities. The spice trade routes represented favorite hunting grounds for pirates, not just because spices were valuable for trading, but because they could dramatically improve the palatability of otherwise bland or unpleasant meals. Black pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and other exotic spices could transform salt pork and hardtack from merely edible to something that resembled actual cuisine. A small quantity of the right spice could make an enormous difference in crew morale by providing sensory variety and the psychological comfort of eating something that tasted good rather than simply providing nutrition. Pirates became connoisseurs of spices, learning to evaluate quality and potency, while developing techniques for using small amounts to maximum effect. Wine and other alcoholic beverages captured from merchant vessels provided variety from the constant diet of rum and grog, while potentially offering better quality and flavor than the harsh spirits typically available to pirates. Fine wines were not only valuable for trade, but could provide medicinal benefits and social lubricant for crew interactions. Beer, when captured fresh, was often preferred over rum by many pirates because it was less intoxicating, more filling, and provided some nutritional value through its grain content. However, beer's limited storage life meant it had to be consumed quickly, often leading to periods of relative abundance, followed by return to the usual rum rations. Spirits like brandy, whiskey, or imported liqueurs could serve multiple purposes as beverages, medicines, and trade goods. High-quality spirits were often reserved for special occasions or used as currency in ports where pirates needed to conduct business or obtain supplies. The process of raiding for food required careful planning that balanced nutritional needs against tactical considerations. Pirates had to evaluate potential targets based not just on their monetary cargo, but on their likely food supplies, crew size, defensive capabilities, and the time required to transfer goods between ships. Intelligence gathering about merchant shipping became crucial for successful food raids. Pirates developed networks of informants in ports who could provide information about ships' cargo manifests, provisioning practices, and departure schedules. This intelligence allowed pirates to target vessels that were likely to carry fresh provisions or specific types of food supplies. The timing of raids was often influenced by seasonal patterns in food availability and shipping schedules. Spring raids might yield ships stocked with preserved foods for long voyages, while autumn attacks could capture vessels loaded with newly harvested grains, fruits, and other seasonal products. Shore raids on coastal settlements represented another method of food acquisition, though these operations were often more dangerous than ship attacks, due to the possibility of organized resistance from local militias or military forces. Coastal communities typically maintained gardens, livestock, and food stores that could sustain pirate crews for extended periods. The success of shore raids depended heavily on intelligence about the target community's defenses, population, and food resources. Pirates would often observe coastal settlements for days or weeks before attacking, learning about daily routines, defensive preparations, and the location of food supplies. Some shore raids were conducted more like business transactions than military operations, with pirates offering to trade captured goods or services for food supplies, rather than simply taking what they wanted through violence. This approach was often more sustainable and less likely to result in organized retaliation from colonial authorities. The psychological warfare aspect of piracy extended to food acquisition strategies. Pirates cultivated terrifying reputations, partly to encourage merchant crews to surrender quickly without fighting, preserving both lives and provisions. A ship that surrendered without resistance would have its food stores intact, while one that fought might have its provisions damaged by cannon fire or fires started during battle. Trading and bartering represented legitimate methods of food acquisition that blurred the lines between piracy and commerce. Pirates might use captured treasure, exotic goods, or even their services as fighters to obtain food and supplies from merchants who were willing to overlook the questionable sources of their wealth. Certain ports developed reputations as places where pirates could obtain supplies through quasi-legal means. Port Royal in Jamaica became legendary as a place where pirates could spend their ill-gotten gains on food, drink, and other necessities without asking too many questions about the sources of their wealth. The merchants in these pirate-friendly ports were often willing to overlook the questionable backgrounds of their customers, in exchange for the substantial profits that could be made from selling supplies to well-funded but desperate crews. These commercial relationships were mutually beneficial and helped sustain pirate operations over extended periods. Water procurement was often as critical as food acquisition, requiring pirates to seek out sources of fresh water through raids, shore expeditions, or trading. The quality of available water varied dramatically depending on the source, with some natural springs providing clean, sweet water while others were contaminated or brackish. Pirates became expert at evaluating water sources for safety, taste, and storage potential. They learned to identify signs of contamination, developed techniques for improving water quality through filtration or boiling, and created systems for rationing and preserving their most precious liquid resource. The distribution of acquired food among crew members was governed by strict codes and democratic agreements that had been established before voyages began. Most pirate ships had detailed rules about how captured provisions would be shared, with specific portions allocated to officers, crew members who participated in raids, and those who remained with the ship during operations. These food-sharing agreements were taken extremely seriously because violations could lead to mutiny, violence, or the breakdown of crew cohesion. Pirates understood that fair distribution of food was essential for maintaining the cooperation and trust necessary for successful operations and survival. As we near the end of our exploration into the harsh realities of pirate cuisine, it's crucial to understand how these eating habits and nutritional challenges shaped not just individual health, but the entire culture, social structure, and historical legacy of piracy itself. The constant struggle for adequate nutrition created a culture of resourcefulness and adaptability that extended far beyond food acquisition and influenced every aspect of pirate society. Pirates became expert problem solvers who could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges, whether related to food, ship maintenance, navigation, or survival in hostile environments. This resourcefulness was born from necessity. Pirates who could adapt and innovate simply didn't survive long enough to establish reputations or accumulate wealth. The skills developed through managing scarce food resources translated into abilities that made pirates effective at other aspects of their dangerous profession. The shared experience of poor nutrition and constant hunger created bonds among crew members that transcended traditional social divisions based on nationality, race, or previous occupation. When everyone aboard ship was eating the same weevily hardtack and salt pork, differences in background became less important than mutual cooperation for survival. The democratic principles that characterized many pirate crews may have been rooted in the equalizing experience of shared deprivation and the recognition that survival depended on everyone working together effectively. Food scarcity created a natural incentive for cooperation rather than hierarchy. The pirate obsession with treasure and wealth was motivated as much by the desire for better food and living conditions as by simple greed or materialism. Gold and silver represented the means to purchase fresh provisions. Higher skilled cooks access better ports and markets, and ultimately escape the cycle of malnutrition and deprivation that characterized life at sea. The notorious behavior of pirates when they reached port, spending money freely on food, drink, and entertainment, represented a psychological reaction to months of deprivation and uncertainty. Pirates would often consume enormous quantities of fresh food and drink when the opportunity arose, knowing that they might not have another chance for months. The cultural stereotype of pirates as heavy drinkers was based in reality, but the underlying causes were more complex than simple recreational alcohol abuse. Rum and other alcoholic beverages served as medicine, currency, water purification systems, and psychological comfort during extended periods of hardship and danger. The relationship between pirates and alcohol was complicated by its necessity for survival in an era when safe drinking water was difficult to maintain during long sea voyages. Pirates who abstained from alcohol entirely would have faced serious health risks from contaminated water, making moderate alcohol consumption a rational survival strategy. The relatively short careers of most pirates were influenced by nutritional factors as much as by the obvious dangers of their profession. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making pirates vulnerable to diseases that might not have been fatal to better nourished individuals. The physical demands of life at sea required good nutrition, and pirates rarely had consistent access to adequate food. Chronic malnutrition also affected cognitive function, decision-making abilities, and emotional stability in ways that made pirates more likely to take unnecessary risks, engage in self-destructive behavior, or make tactical errors that led to capture or death. The combination of poor nutrition, alcohol consumption, and chronic stress created a population that was often unpredictable and prone to violence. The eventual decline of piracy as a major force on the world's oceans was partially due to improvements in food preservation, naval logistics, and understanding of nutrition that gave legitimate navies significant advantages over pirate crews. As governments developed better systems for keeping their sailors healthy during long voyages, they gained tactical and strategic advantages that made pirate operations increasingly difficult to sustain. The British Royal Navy's systematic adoption of lime juice rations, improved food preservation techniques, and better understanding of maritime nutrition allowed them to maintain crews at sea for extended periods without the devastating health problems that continued to plague pirate ships operating with limited resources and knowledge. Modern perceptions of pirate food and lifestyle are heavily influenced by romantic, fictional portrayals that bear virtually no resemblance to historical reality. The image of pirates enjoying lavish feasts, fine wines, and abundant fresh food is a product of imagination rather than historical fact, created by authors and filmmakers who prioritized entertainment value over accuracy. Understanding the reality of pirate nutrition helps us appreciate both the harshness of their chosen lifestyle and their remarkable ability to survive in conditions that would challenge even modern adventurers. With access to advanced technology and medical knowledge, the fact that pirates managed to operate effectively while suffering from chronic malnutrition demonstrates extraordinary human resilience and determination. The legacy of pirate food preservation techniques and nutritional knowledge contributed to later advances in maritime provisioning and food science. Many of the methods developed or refined by sailors, including pirates, for keeping food edible during long sea voyages, influenced subsequent developments in food preservation technology and naval logistics. The rum culture that developed among pirates had lasting impacts on Caribbean society and other regions where piracy flourished. Rum production and consumption patterns established during the pirate era influenced local economies, cultural practices, and social customs that persist in various forms today. The association between rum and maritime culture owes much to its practical importance in pirate nutrition and survival, rather than simple recreational drinking. Modern, pirate-themed bars and restaurants that emphasize rum consumption are unknowingly paying tribute to the beverage's historical role as a life-saving necessity rather than a party drink. So, after learning about the complete reality of pirate food, the weevily hardtack that could break teeth, the salt pork so hard it could be used as weapons, the constant threat of scurvy and other nutritional diseases, the desperate searches for fresh food that drove tactical decisions, the creative but often inadequate attempts to make inedible provisions somehow survivable, would you still want to live the pirate life? The romantic image of pirate life, with its promise of freedom, adventure, and treasure, becomes significantly less appealing when you consider that daily existence would revolve around consuming food that modern people would consider inedible garbage while fighting off diseases that are completely preventable with proper nutrition. The treasure and plunder that motivate fictional pirates were, for real pirates, often simply means to an end, and that end was frequently just staying alive long enough to see another sunrise. A fresh apple or a piece of soft bread would have been more immediately valuable to a scurvy-ridden pirate than a chest full of gold coins. The next time you watch a pirate movie and see crews enjoying magnificent feasts with fresh bread, roasted meats, and abundant wine, remember that this scene represents pure fantasy. The reality was that most pirates would have wept with joy at the sight of food that wasn't crawling with insects or hard enough to use as ammunition. Their greatest victories weren't necessarily the battles they won or the ships they captured, but simply surviving another day in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and adaptability. Every morning they woke up healthy enough to work was a triumph over malnutrition, disease, and the harsh realities of their chosen profession. The story of pirate food is ultimately a story of human resilience, resourcefulness, and the lengths people will go to survive in impossible circumstances. Despite facing nutritional challenges that would defeat many modern people with all our advantages in food, science, and medical knowledge, pirates managed to survive and even thrive for limited periods in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. They developed techniques, traditions, and cultural practices that helped them cope with constant hunger and poor nutrition, while maintaining the cooperation and morale necessary for effective operations. Their innovations in food preservation, preparation, and acquisition were born from desperate necessity, but contributed to broader knowledge about maritime survival. But it's also a story of tremendous human cost and preventable suffering. The diseases, dental problems, chronic malnutrition, and premature deaths that characterized pirate life were largely preventable tragedies that resulted from their outlaw status, limited resources, and the primitive understanding of nutrition that characterized their era. Understanding the complete reality of pirate food doesn't diminish the historical significance of piracy or disrespect the courage of those who chose that dangerous life. Instead, it helps us appreciate the full scope of challenges they faced and the remarkable fact that they managed to survive and leave their mark on history despite obstacles that went far beyond battles, storms, and legal authorities. The next time you sit down to a meal with fresh vegetables, clean water, variety of flavors, and food that doesn't require tools to make it edible, perhaps you'll have a new appreciation for the simple luxury of adequate nutrition that most modern people take for granted. The pirates of history would have envied you far more for your dinner than for any material possessions you might own. In the end, the most important lesson from studying what pirates ate during their long voyages isn't about any particular food item or preservation technique. It's about understanding that freedom always comes with a price, and sometimes that price is paid one terrible necessary life-sustaining meal at a time. That's the complete, unvarnished story of pirate food. Not the romantic feasts of Hollywood imagination, but a daily struggle for survival that tested human limits while demonstrating the extraordinary lengths people will go to maintain their chosen way of life, no matter how harsh the consequences. It's a story that reminds us that even the most adventurous lifestyle involves mundane realities that can be far more challenging than any dramatic battle or treasure hunt.